Hello there, and welcome to the Sleepy Science Channel. Tonight, we're stepping into the warm and astonishing world of bread. It may seem simple at first: flour, water, salt, and heat. But few things in human life have carried more history, science, and survival than a loaf of bread. This is a food shaped by living yeast, invisible chemistry, ancient fields, and human hands. It has fed cities, crossed deserts, sparked revolutions, built traditions, and filled homes with one of the most irresistible smells on earth. The story of bread is far larger than a kitchen counter. It reaches back to the first fires and forward into modern food science. It lives in bubbling starters, crackling crusts, hot stone ovens, and shared tables. It changes from place to place, becoming flatbread, sourdough, rye, focaccia, and countless other forms, each with its own history and its own secrets. If you enjoy these gentle journeys, I invite you to like, subscribe, or share a thought below. It helps others find their way here too, one sleepy soul at a time. But for now, all you need to do is relax. Let your shoulders soften. Let your breathing slow. Allow your thoughts to drift as we explore this fascinating world. Let's begin. Bread began as a life-changing accident of grain, water, and fire. No one sat down at the dawn of history and designed a loaf from theory. It seems to have emerged from trial, chance, and attention. Somewhere, people gathering wild grain crushed it, mixed it with water, and laid the paste on hot stone or in embers. What came back was not raw seed anymore. It was softer, sweeter, easier to chew, and far easier to carry than a sack of grain. That mattered enormously. Grain in its natural form is stubborn food. It asks for labor, tools, and patience. Once heat transformed it, the same harvest could feed more people with less effort at each meal. That simple discovery changed daily life. A cooked mixture of grass seeds became something human communities could build around. In a strange way, one of civilization's most powerful inventions may have begun with somebody noticing that a scorched paste tasted far better than it had any right to. A loaf can rise because billions of living yeasts breathe inside it. What looks like a smooth mound of dough is really a crowded living world. Yeast cells feed on sugars released from flour, and as they do, they produce carbon dioxide and alcohol. The gas cannot escape easily once a strong dough forms, so it collects in thousands of tiny pockets. Those pockets stretch and multiply until the whole mass swells upward. In other words, a loaf lifts itself because countless microscopic organisms are eating and exhaling inside it. That alone makes bread feel almost magical. The baker cannot see the workers. The dough seems still. Yet under the surface, life is busy turning paste into structure. Warmth wakes the process. Time deepens it. Then the oven takes over. Heat kills the yeast, but not before the trapped gas expands one last time and gives the loaf its final push. The airy slice on the table began as invisible breath caught in a net of dough. For thousands of years, bread was as valuable as money. In many societies, this was not a side dish or a comfort food. It was the center of survival, which meant it carried real economic power. Grain stores determined whether cities stayed calm or turned desperate. Workers could be paid in grain or loaves. Armies marched on bread. Governments watched its price closely because a shortage could become a political crisis with astonishing speed. When people say someone was earning their bread, the phrase carries the memory of an older world where food and livelihood were nearly the same thing. Even the difference between coarse dark loaves and fine white ones signaled class, wealth, and access. Bread was never just nutrition. It was status, labor, wages, taxation, and control. A failed harvest could empty tables and shake kingdoms. A full granary could steady a nation through winter. Few objects we now treat as ordinary once sat so close to the heart of power. A loaf could fill a stomach, but it could also hold a society together. One simple loaf carries chemistry, history, farming, and human survival together. Almost no everyday object contains so many stories at once. Start with the field. Bread begins in domesticated grasses that humans reshaped over thousands of years, selecting grains that held onto their seeds, yielded more food, and could be harvested in bulk. Move to the mill, where hard kernels become soft flour through force and engineering. Add water, salt, microbes, and heat, and suddenly chemistry takes command. Proteins link, starches absorb moisture, enzymes unlock sugars, gases build, crust browns, and aroma blues. But the loaf does not stop at science. It carries trade routes, weather patterns, labor systems, religious rituals, and family habits as well. It remembers the farmer, the baker, the oven builder, and the person who first saved seed for another season. That is what makes it so fascinating. It looks modest on the table, yet it contains an entire chain of human knowledge. Few foods reveal so clearly how survival became culture and how culture became something delicious enough to share. The crust and the crumb are built by completely different transformations. Slice through a loaf, and you are looking at two worlds formed in the same oven under different rules. Inside, the crumb develops in a moist environment. Water stays trapped long enough for starches to gel and proteins to set around expanding pockets of gas. That is where softness comes from. It is a structure created by steam, elasticity, and careful timing. Outside, the crust faces a harsher fate. Moisture escapes. The surface dries. Temperature climbs fast enough for browning reactions to race ahead, producing deep color, stronger flavor, and that fragile shell that crackles as it cools. One part becomes tender and open. The other becomes dark, aromatic, and crisp. They are not just different in texture. They are the result of different physical and chemical journeys happening inches apart. That contrast is one reason bread feels so satisfying to eat. In a single bite, you get softness and resistance, sweetness and roast, quiet interior and dramatic exterior. Ancient people were baking bread long before they built great empires. Bread belongs to a chapter of human history far older than palaces, armies, and monumental stone. Archaeologists have found evidence that people were grinding plants and making flatbread-like foods many thousands of years before the rise of the great states we usually learn about first. That means bread was already old when the earliest empires appeared. It fed communities that had no written language, no coins, and no kings carved into monuments. Imagine what that says about its importance. Before formal cities, before huge temples, before imperial roads, people were already gathering seeds, crushing them into meal, and using heat to turn them into reliable food. This places bread close to the root of settled human life, but even before full settlement, it was becoming a known and useful technology. It was one of those quiet inventions that changed everything without announcing itself. Long before rulers mastered territory, ordinary people had already mastered a remarkable transformation. They had learned how to make fields edible in a new way. Every culture on Earth seems to have invented its own bread. Wherever humans found a dependable starch and a way to apply heat, something bread-like often appeared. Wheat became loaves and flatbreads across huge parts of Eurasia. Maize became tortillas in the Americas. Teff, became injera in Ethiopia. Rice, millet, barley, rye, sorghum, and cassava all found their way into local forms shaped by landscape, tools, and taste. Some were rolled thin and cooked fast. Some were steamed. Some puffed over flame. Some were fermented until they developed sour depth and springy texture. What is so striking is that these foods are not copies of one original idea spreading unchanged. They feel like repeated acts of invention, each answering the same human problem in a different voice. How do you turn a harvest into something portable, filling, shareable, and good? The answers differ, but the instinct is familiar everywhere. That is why bread feels both local and universal at once. It belongs to specific places, yet it also feels like a language humanity keeps rediscovering. A sourdough starter can outlive the baker who first made it. That jar on the counter is not merely an ingredient waiting for use. It is a living culture that can be maintained for years, decades, and in some cases passed from one generation to the next. Feed it flour and water, keep it in balance, and it continues. What survives is not a single immortal organism, but a stable community, renewing itself again and again. In that sense, a starter is more like a flame being handed onward than a finished object being preserved. Some families and bakeries treat theirs almost like an heirloom. It gathers routine, memory, and place. It travels through kitchens, survives moves, returns from neglect, and carries the habits of the hands that care for it. There is something extraordinary in that. A loaf is temporary. It cools, is sliced, and disappears. But the culture behind it can remain alive long after the first person who mixed it is gone. Bread rarely feels ancient in the moment of eating, yet here is a form of continuity you can stir with a spoon. Bread helped turn wandering humans into settled civilizations with cities. A hunter can move with the seasons, but grain asks for a different relationship with land. It must be sown, watched, harvested, stored, protected, and processed. Once people began depending heavily on cereals, they were pulled into longer commitments to place. Bread sits at the center of that shift because it turns stored grain into everyday nourishment. A field of wheat is potential. A loaf is dinner. That conversion allowed harvests to support larger populations through time, which in turn made permanent villages more viable. From there came granaries, ovens, boundaries, schedules, and the coordination required for life in one place. Surplus grain could feed craftspeople, officials, builders, and people who were no longer farming all day themselves. In other words, bread helped free human communities to become more complex. It did not build cities alone, of course, but it helped make city life possible. Behind walls, markets, and temples stood a simpler truth. Dense populations need dependable food, and bread became one of humanity's great answers. The first breads were probably flat, smoky, and cooked on hot stone. Before ovens, tins, and village bakeries, the earliest versions were likely far simpler and far rougher. Imagine a paste made from crushed grain and water, pressed thin by hand, then laid onto a heated rock beside a fire. It would cook fast on one side, blister in spots, char at the edges, and pick up smoke from the fuel that heated it. That first bite would have been dense, chewy, and probably astonishing. Suddenly, the harvest was no longer a pile of stubborn seeds. It had become something portable, warm, and far easier to share. Flat shape was not a style choice. It was practical. Thin dough cooks before the fire dies and before the outside burns too deeply. In many ways, this old method never vanished. Across the world, people still bake on stones, metal plates, and clay walls, keeping alive a technique that may reach back to the first time grain ever met flame. Ciabatta was invented surprisingly recently to answer a sandwich problem. For a bread that feels ancient and rustic, ciabatta is a remarkable newcomer. It emerged in Italy in the late 20th century, partly as a response to the popularity of baguette-style sandwiches. Bakers wanted a loaf that could stand up to fillings while still feeling distinctly Italian. The answer was a wet, lively dough that baked into a slipper-shaped loaf with a thin crust and a wildly open interior. That airy structure was not just beautiful, it mattered. It made the bread light enough to bite through, yet sturdy enough to hold cured meats, cheese, and olive oil without turning into paste. In other words, ciabatta was designed for the modern sandwich age, even though it now looks like it has always existed. That is one of bread's great tricks. A newly invented loaf can feel timeless almost at once. Ciabatta shows that bread history is still being written, and that even recent needs can create something that quickly seems rooted in tradition. Wild yeast can drift into dough from the air around us. Leave flour and water together long enough, and the world begins to join in. Invisible yeast cells move through kitchens, fields, bakeries, and homes all the time. They ride on dust, settle on surfaces, and pass from hands, sacks, and wooden tools into waiting dough. Not every drifting microbe survives there, but some do, and once they find conditions they like, they begin to multiply. That is part of what makes spontaneous fermentation feel so uncanny. A bowl that looked lifeless yesterday can show bubbles, sour aroma, and movement by the next day, as if the room itself leaned in to help. Air is only part of the story, since flour and equipment carry microbes too, but the larger point remains the same. Bread is never made in isolation. Every place has its own microscopic weather. When dough captures it, the loaf becomes a small record of its surroundings, shaped not only by ingredients, but by the unseen life already present in the space. Flour can explode with terrifying force when dust hangs in air. A sack of flour looks harmless. A spoonful scattered on a counter seems softer still. Yet when fine flour dust fills the air in a confined space, it becomes surprisingly dangerous. Each tiny particle has enormous surface area compared with its size, which means oxygen can surround it almost completely. Give that suspended cloud a spark, and combustion can race through it with shocking speed. The result is not a slow fire, but a violent pressure wave. Mills, silos, and industrial bakeries learned this lesson at great cost, which is why dust control became such a serious part of grain handling. The danger comes not from the flour sitting quietly in a bag, but from the same flour dispersed into the air like fuel waiting for ignition. There is something startling about that transformation. The powder that becomes soft bread can also behave like an explosive under the wrong conditions. Once again, bread reveals an unexpected side, where everyday food crosses into the laws of fire and force. A loaf rises because gluten traps gas like an edible net. When flour and water meet, certain proteins in wheat begin linking together into something remarkable. With mixing and movement, they form long elastic strands that create a flexible network throughout the dough. That network is what gives structure to the rise. Gas produced during fermentation presses outward, but instead of escaping at once, it is caught in countless tiny pockets. The dough stretches rather than collapses. Picture a net made not of rope but of protein, thin enough to remain invisible and strong enough to hold expanding breath. That is what turns heavy paste into something airy. Without it, gas would slip away and the final loaf would stay dense. This is one reason wheat became so important in baking. Its proteins are unusually good at building a stretchable framework. Bakers learn to strengthen or relax that framework through mixing, resting, and shaping, long before they knew the chemistry involved. Every high-risen loaf depends on that hidden architecture doing its work in silence. Wheat was not always easy to turn into soft, airy bread. Modern bakers inherit a grain shaped by thousands of years of human selection, but earlier wheat was not always so cooperative. Ancient varieties often behaved differently in the bowl and in the oven. Some were harder to thresh. Some produced coarser flour. Some offered weaker or less predictable baking qualities. Soft, lofty bread was not waiting fully formed in the field. It emerged gradually as people chose seeds from plants that yielded better harvests and grain more suitable for grinding and baking. Then milling improved. Sieving improved. Storage improved. Every step nudged the process forward. What now seems like a natural property of wheat is partly the result of a long conversation between humans and a grass. Over generations, farmers and bakers shaped one another's work. The crop changed to suit the loaf, and the loaf changed to suit the crop. A tender slice on a plate today carries the memory of countless seasons when wheat still resisted becoming the bread we now take for granted. Bread ovens changed architecture, neighborhoods, and daily life in ancient towns. Once bread became central to survival, the oven became more than a cooking tool. It became a force that shaped how communities organized space. Baking large numbers of loaves required sturdy structures that could hold and radiate intense heat, which meant clay, brick, stone, fuel storage, and careful placement. In many towns, ovens were shared because building and maintaining one was costly. That changed the rhythm of daily life. People brought dough to common baking sites, met neighbors there, exchanged news, and planned meals around firing times. Streets, courtyards, and workshops adapted to the needs of heat and grain. In some places, authorities regulated who could bake and where, because ovens involved both commerce and fire risk. A loaf might seem domestic, but the infrastructure behind it could be distinctly urban. Bread helped organize labor, public space, and routine. You could almost map a settlement through its grain stores and ovens. Architecture, in that sense, rose partly in answer to hunger. Some of the oldest known breads were baked before pottery existed. That detail changes the whole picture. We often imagine advanced cooking beginning with pots, storage jars, and settled village life. Yet evidence suggests people were making bread-like foods before ceramics had become part of everyday technology in many places. That means grain was already being processed with enough skill to grind, mix, and cook it using simpler tools and heated surfaces. Think about what that implies. People without pots had still worked out how to transform wild plants into something more nourishing and manageable. They had stones for grinding, hearths for heat, and enough knowledge to repeat the process. Bread did not wait for civilization to hand it a full kitchen. It arrived earlier, carried by ingenuity rather than equipment. In some ways, that makes it even more impressive. The food we now associate with ovens and bakeries may have deep roots in a world of campfires, handstones, and temporary shelters. Its history begins not in comfort, but in improvisation. The same grain can make wildly different loaves in different climates. Flour is never just flour. The grain that produces it grows under specific rains, temperatures, soils, and seasons, and those conditions shape how it behaves later in dough. One harvest may absorb more water. Another may ferment faster. One may build strong structure. Another may feel softer, weaker, or more fragrant. Climate affects the plant in the field, but it also keeps affecting the baker afterward. Warm air speeds fermentation. Dry air pulls moisture from the surface. Humid weather changes how flour stores and mixes. Even the oven can perform differently depending on the surrounding environment. That is why bread traditions became so tied to place. Bakers were not only following recipes, they were working with local grain under local weather, often adapting by feel rather than formula. A loaf made from the same named grain in one region may emerge very differently in another. Bread is deeply geographical. It carries the field into the kitchen, then lets the kitchen answer back. Kneading transforms sticky paste into a springy structure strong enough to rise. At first, dough can feel unimpressive. It clings to fingers, slumps under its own weight, and seems barely more organized than mud. Then kneading begins. Push, fold, turn, repeat. With each motion, the dough becomes less chaotic and more coherent. Proteins align and bond. Moisture distributes more evenly. Resistance grows beneath the hands. What looked like shapeless paste starts pushing back. That moment is one of the hidden pleasures of baking, because the change is so physical. You can feel structure arriving. The dough becomes smoother, more elastic, and more alive, as if it has discovered its purpose. Long before bakers had microscopes or protein chemistry, they knew this transformation mattered. Their hands told them so. Too little work, and the dough stayed weak. Enough work, and it developed the strength to hold gas, keep shape, and rise with confidence. Kneading is therefore not just mixing. It is the act that teaches dough how to behave like bread, instead of remaining a wet heap of flour. Salt does far more than simply make bread taste better. It certainly sharpens flavor, but its role goes much deeper than seasoning. In dough, salt helps tighten the protein structure, giving more strength and better control to the final shape. It also slows fermentation, which matters because unchecked yeast can race ahead, exhausting the dough before flavor and structure properly develop. A small amount therefore acts like a conductor, keeping the whole performance in time. Remove it, and bread often tastes flat, ferments too fast, and feels strangely weak. Add it wisely, and the loaf becomes more stable, more balanced, and more satisfying. There is also something beautiful in how little is needed. A modest handful can influence taste, texture, and tempo all at once. That is why bakers treat salt with respect. It is not a decorative extra sprinkled on at the end. It is one of the quiet powers inside the dough, steering events from the very beginning. Bread reminds us again that small things can govern astonishingly large outcomes. Water temperature can quietly decide the fate of an entire loaf. Dough responds to temperature like a living system, because in many ways, it is one. Yeast activity, enzyme speed, and the feel of the dough all shift depending on how warm or cool the water is at mixing. Use water that is too cold, and fermentation may crawl along so slowly that timing and development drift off course. Use water that is too warm, and the dough can race ahead before it has built the flavor or strength it needs. Extreme heat can even damage the microbes meant to power the rise. This is why experienced bakers pay such close attention to the bowl at the very beginning. The future loaf is already being steered. Water does not merely wet the flour. It sets the opening conditions for everything that follows. A few degrees can change the schedule of an entire bake. It is a wonderful example of bread's hidden sensitivity. Something as ordinary as tap water can decide whether the dough remains sluggish, turns unruly, or develops with beautiful balance. Time is one of bread's most powerful and least visible ingredients. You can measure flour, water, and salt, but time behaves differently. It leaves no scoop mark and adds no visible layer, yet it changes everything. Given enough of it, dough develops deeper flavor, better texture, and greater complexity than speed alone can produce. Enzymes continue working. Fermentation reshapes the interior. Aroma compounds slowly build. Structure relaxes and strengthens in cycles that cannot be rushed without some loss. That is why long-made bread often tastes more complete, as though the ingredients had more to say because they were not interrupted. Time can also redeem simplicity. A loaf with only a few ingredients may become far more interesting if allowed to develop slowly. This is one of the most beautiful things about bread making. Patience becomes edible. Hours disappear into something you can later smell, slice, and share. In a world that often rewards speed, bread still preserves an older lesson. Some transformations reveal their best qualities only when nothing hurries them along. Fermentation makes dough more digestible before it ever reaches the oven. Long before heat seps the loaf, microbes are already doing important work. As yeast and bacteria feed and grow, they begin breaking down some of the components in flour into simpler forms. Enzymes assist, unlocking sugars and altering complex structures that would otherwise remain more difficult for the body to process. In certain breads, especially slowly fermented ones, this can reduce compounds that some people find troublesome and can also influence how nutrients become available. The dough, in a sense, is being pre-digested. Not finished, of course, but gently prepared. That makes fermentation feel like more than rising. It is a form of transformation that begins the conversation between bread and the body before the first bite ever happens. Ancient bakers did not describe it in biochemical terms, yet they often knew from experience that slower breads could feel better, taste better, and keep better. What they observed by instinct, science later helped explain. Bread becomes more hospitable through the patient work of invisible life. Sourdough is an entire ecosystem hiding inside something wonderfully humble. A sourdough culture may look like nothing more than flour and water in a jar, but inside it lives a constantly shifting society of organisms. Yeasts and bacteria share the same environment, compete, cooperate, and alter the conditions around them as they grow. Acids rise, aromas deepen, bubbles form. The balance between members of this tiny world influences the final bread in ways no single ingredient could achieve alone. What makes this so fascinating is the scale. An ecosystem sounds like a forest, a coral reef, or a river valley. Yet here it exists in a spoonful of starter or a kitchen shelf. It has its own population pressures, food supply, rhythms, and responses to disturbance. Feed it differently, and the community shifts. Change the temperature, and different microbes gain an advantage. Still, if treated well, the system finds its balance and becomes beautifully reliable. Bread making here becomes a partnership with a living miniature world, one that rewards attention with character, depth, and life. One starter can contain yeasts and bacteria living in delicate balance. What gives sourdough its character is not a single heroic microbe doing all the work. It is the balance between different organisms sharing the same food and space. Yeasts help produce gas, which gives lift and openness. Lactic acid bacteria shape flavor, preserve the dough, and influence texture through the acids they create. Neither side simply dominates forever. If the conditions tilt too far one way, the culture changes, and the bread changes with it. That is why maintaining a starter can feel almost like tending an instrument that drifts out of tune if neglected. Feed ratio, temperature, flour type, and timing all affect which organisms thrive. Yet when the balance is right, the result is extraordinary. The loaf gains rise, aroma, tang, and keeping quality from a partnership no baker could reproduce through one organism alone. The beauty lies in the fragility of the arrangement. A stable starter is not static. It is an active piece between tiny lives, renewing itself day after day. No two sourdough starters in the world are exactly alike. Two jars may begin with the same flour and water, yet time will pull them apart. Microbes arrive from different hands, tools, grains, and rooms. Feeding habits diverge. One culture lives warm on a counter. Another spends most of its life in the cold. One is refreshed often. Another waits longer between meals. Gradually, each develops its own balance, aroma, pace, and behavior. This is why starters can feel strangely personal. They are shaped by place, but also by routine. A bakery starter in one city will not become identical to one in another, even if the bakers try to copy each other closely. The differences may be subtle or dramatic, but they matter. They affect sourness, timing, resilience, and the final personality of the loaf. In that sense, every starter becomes a local creature. It belongs to a household, a climate, a practice. Bread often feels universal, yet here it becomes beautifully specific, shaped by circumstances so fine they can barely be seen. The smell of fresh bread can trigger hunger before the first bite. Long before bread touches the tongue, it reaches the brain. The aroma that spills from an oven is not one simple smell, but a cloud of hundreds of compounds released as heat transforms dough. Some suggest sweetness. Some suggest roasted nuts, caramel, malt, or browned butter. Together they create one of the most persuasive signals in human experience. That signal moves fast. Smell travels directly into brain systems tied to memory, reward, and appetite, which is why a bakery can make someone hungry even after a full meal. It is not weakness. It is wiring. For many people, that scent also carries layers of memory from kitchens, markets, holidays, or childhood breakfasts. So the response is doubled. The body prepares for food, and the mind opens a door to the past at the same moment. Few foods announce themselves so convincingly. Bread does not wait politely to be noticed. It enters the room and changes how the whole room feels. A baker can shape the same dough into completely different textures. One batch can become a tight sandwich loaf, an airy boule, slender rolls, or a wide flat form with a very different eating experience, even before ingredients change. Shape influences how gas is distributed, how tension sits on the surface, and how the loaf expands in the oven. Fold dough firmly and create a taut outer skin, and it may rise upward with more strength. Flatten it and spread it wide, and the result can be softer, more open, or more tender in a different way. Size matters too. Small pieces bake faster and lose moisture differently from large loaves with thick interiors. This makes shaping one of bread's most underrated arts. It is not just cosmetic. It decides how the dough carries itself into heat. Bakers are therefore not merely making forms that look attractive. They're designing the eating experience in advance. A crusty round and a soft pan loaf may begin with nearly the same mixture, yet shape guides them toward entirely different destinies. Steam at the start of baking helps create a better crust. The first minutes in the oven are a critical threshold. If the surface dries too quickly, it can harden before the dough has fully expanded, limiting volume and dulling the final crust. Steam changes that opening moment. Moist air keeps the exterior flexible, allowing the loaf to stretch more freely as heat drives rapid expansion. This period of final swelling can make the difference between a loaf that opens beautifully and one that stays constrained. Steam also affects the way starch behaves on the surface, helping it gelatinize and later bake into a thinner, more brittle crust with better sheen. That is why professional ovens often inject steam at the start, and why home bakers improvise with trays of water, covered pots, or hop surfaces that release moisture. The effect feels dramatic for something so fleeting. A brief cloud at the beginning helps determine the loaf's final look, sound, and bite. Bread once again depends on timing, where a short moment reshapes the whole result. The shine on some loaves comes from starch, not fat. A glossy crust can look rich enough to suggest butter, egg, or oil, but sometimes its shine comes from something simpler and more surprising. As the surface heats in a moist environment, starches there absorb water and swell into a gel. Later, as baking continues, that gel sets into a smooth, reflective finish. The effect can be especially striking on breads baked with steam or finished with a light starch wash. What you see is not greasiness, but a transformed carbohydrate surface catching the light. There is something elegant in that. A loaf can achieve beauty not through lavish ingredients, but through the behavior of its most basic components under heat and moisture. This kind of shine tells a story about process. It speaks of careful baking conditions rather than simple enrichment. The eye reads it as luxury, but the science behind it is wonderfully modest. Bread often works this way. It creates impressive effects from ordinary materials, provided temperature, water, and timing meet at exactly the right moment. Bread can stale even when it has not actually dried out. Staling is one of bread's quiet mysteries, because it feels like drying. Yet that is not the whole story. A loaf can still hold plenty of moisture and still lose its fresh softness. What changes is the internal arrangement of starch. After baking, the starches that had swollen and softened begin gradually reorganizing into a firmer structure. As that happens, the crumb feels tougher, less springy, and less tender on the tongue. Moisture may also migrate from the interior toward the crust, altering texture even if the loaf as a whole has not become truly dry. This is why bread can seem disappointingly old before it feels hard as a rock. It is undergoing an internal reshaping, understanding that changes how we see freshness. Bread is not simply evaporating into decline. It is continuing to change long after it leaves the oven. In a sense, staling is a second phase of its life, where chemistry keeps moving forward even after the bake appears complete. Freezing bread can preserve softness better than leaving it on shelves. It sounds backward at first, because freezing feels harsher than ordinary storage. Yet a loaf left on the counter keeps moving towards staleness, while a loaf frozen at the right moment is almost held in place. The key is timing. Once the bread has cooled fully, the freezer slows the internal changes that make the crumb firm and tired. Instead of drifting steadily away from freshness, it pauses close to where it was. That is why good bread often revives so beautifully after thawing and warming. The structure has not been given days to age on the shelf. It has been caught early. Bakers and home cooks have known this for years, even without the lab language. A loaf that would seem dull by tomorrow can return with surprising life if frozen the day it was baked. Bread, for a little while, can escape the clock. It is one of the few ways to hold on to that first day softness without eating the whole loaf at once. Toast creates hundreds of new aroma compounds in just minutes. Put a plain slice into heat and it becomes something far more persuasive. As the surface dries and browns, a rapid burst of chemical reactions creates a whole orchestra of new aromas. Notes of nuts, malt, caramel, roasted grain, and even hints that resemble coffee or popcorn can appear in moments. That is why toast smells so much bigger than bread. The heat does not simply warm what was already there. It actively builds a new aromatic world. Even the sound matters. The crisp edge and slight crackle prepare the mouth before the first bite lands. This transformation is so fast that it feels almost theatrical. A soft, mild slice goes into the toaster, and minutes later the kitchen smells richer, deeper, and more urgent. It is one of the clearest examples of how bread can still surprise us after baking is done. Even at the breakfast table, the loaf has one more act left to perform. The brown crust forms through a flavor-making chain called Maillard chemistry. That deep golden shell is not just color. It is a record of intense molecular change. When heat climbs high enough, amino acids and sugars on the surface begin reacting in a complex series of steps that create both pigments and flavor compounds. This is why the crust tastes fuller, darker, and more layered than the pale interior. The reaction does not produce one simple outcome. It creates a whole family of aromas and tastes that suggest roast, toast, bitterness, sweetness, and richness all at once. Bakers watch color so closely for that reason. Too pale, and the loaf may taste unfinished. Too dark, and the balance can tip toward harshness. Somewhere in between lies the sweet spot where chemistry has done its finest work. It is extraordinary to think that the outer surface of bread becomes so delicious through a dance between proteins, sugars, and heat. The crust is not an afterthought. It is where fire writes its signature on the loaf. Bread can taste sweeter after baking, even without extra sugar. Many people assume sweetness in bread must come from added sugar, but heat can pull that impression forward even when none is added beyond what flour naturally provides. During mixing and fermentation, enzymes begin breaking starch into simpler sugars. By the time the loaf enters the oven, those sugars are ready to influence both flavor and browning. Heat then changes the way we perceive them. Roasted aromas, softened starches, and a tender crumb can make sweetness seem stronger than it was in the raw dough. The loaf has not been turned into cake. It has simply unlocked more of the grain's own hidden character. This is one reason the well-made bread can seem faintly honeyed or malty without any obvious sweetener involved. Wheat itself carries more potential than it first appears to. Baking reveals it. What began as flour and water can emerge with a gentle sweetness that feels almost surprising, as though the grain had been keeping one of its best qualities in reserve. Rye behaves so differently from wheat that it changes baking rules. Move from wheat to rye, and the whole conversation shifts. Rye contains less of the strong, elastic structure that gives many wheat loaves height and airy openness. It also carries different starches and gums that make the dough feel stickier, denser, and less eager to behave like a classic white loaf. Handle it the same way as wheat, and disappointment usually follows. Rye asks for other instincts. It often prefers gentler treatment, different hydration, careful acidity, and an acceptance that its beauty may lie in closeness rather than loft. The reward is a flavor world all its own. Deep, earthy, slightly sour, and sometimes almost fruity, it can produce breads of enormous character and staying power. In colder parts of Europe, rye became a backbone grain not because it copied wheat well, but because it offered something different and reliable. It reminds us that bread is not one formula repeated forever. Change the grain, and you may need a completely new language of baking. Whole grain bread keeps parts of the seed white flour removes. A grain kernel is not a simple lump of starch. It is a layered seed with different parts performing different jobs. The bran forms the outer coat. The germ carries the embryo of future growth. The endosperm stores the starch that will fuel it. Whole grain flour keeps all of these parts together, which means the final bread carries more of the seed's original character. That affects taste, texture, color, and nutrition all at once. The bran brings nuttier flavor and a bit more bite. The germ adds richness and oils. The loaf can feel fuller, more complex, and more rooted in the field it came from. This is why whole grain bread often tastes more alive, almost as if the grain is speaking in a less filtered voice. It can be harder to make lofty and soft, because those extra parts change how dough behaves. But that challenge is part of the appeal. The bread stays closer to the original seed that began the story. Milling changed bread forever by separating softness from nutrition and color. Once people learned how to grind grain more finely and sift it more thoroughly, bread changed in profound ways. Milling no longer simply crushed kernels into meal. It became a tool for selecting which parts of the grain would remain and which would be removed. By separating out bran and germ, millers could produce paler flour that baked into softer, lighter loaves. That softness felt luxurious. The texture became finer, the crumb more delicate, and the bread more visually uniform. But something else happened at the same time. Parts of the grain rich in oils, fiber, and distinct flavor were reduced or lost. In other words, milling opened a trade. The loaf could become whiter and softer, but often less complete as a seed. That trade shaped centuries of taste, status, and habit. It is hard to overstate the importance of this shift. A change in grinding technology altered not just texture, but the entire meaning of what many people came to think bread should be. White bread was once a luxury because refinement took so much labor. Today, a pale loaf can seem ordinary, even cheap. But for long stretches of history, it signaled effort, equipment, and privilege. Producing truly white flour required repeated grinding, careful bolting, and the removal of darker grain parts that were easier to leave in. Every stage demanded labor and time, which meant the final bread cost more. Its color became a status marker. To eat a very fine white loaf was to show that you could afford the work required to refine it. Meanwhile, darker breads often remained the daily food of those closer to the field than to wealth. This reversal matters because modern assumptions can make the past hard to imagine. A loaf many people now dismiss as plain once carried prestige. It suggested access to tools, labor, and selective processing. Bread's social meaning is never fixed. Even color can become a signal of class. A crumb's whiteness in that older world was not neutral. It announced that somebody had paid dearly for softness. Dark bread and pale bread have traded social status many times. Food status is rarely permanent, and bread proves it beautifully. In some eras, very white loaves were admired as refined and expensive, while darker loaves were associated with necessity and rougher living. Later, especially in more modern food cultures, the values began to shift. Whole grain breads, once linked with poverty in some places, came to suggest health, authenticity, or artisanal care. Pale industrial loaves, once symbols of privilege, could start to look bland or overprocessed by comparison. What changed was not just flavor. It was what people wanted bread to say about them. One generation may chase softness and whiteness. Another may prize depth, density, and a visible connection to the grain. This makes bread a fascinating social mirror. A loaf can reveal not only what people eat, but what they admire, fear, or hope to project. Even crumb color joins that story. The same shades move through history carrying different meanings, as if bread were constantly changing costumes while remaining itself. Some ancient loaves were flavored with herbs, oil, fruit, or honey. It is easy to imagine old bread as purely functional, made only to fill the stomach. But ancient bakers were often more inventive than that. Archaeological evidence and historical records suggest that breads could be enriched or scented with ingredients that added pleasure as well as nourishment. Olive oil could make the texture more tender. Herbs could lend fragrance. Dried fruit might bring sweetness and chew. Honey could turn a basic dough towards celebration. These additions tell us something important. People did not wait for modern baking to discover that bread could be expressive. Even in very old societies, a loaf could signal feast days, hospitality, ritual, or regional taste. It could move beyond necessity and become part of culture's decorative side. That is a lovely thing to remember. The urge to make bread, not just sustaining, but beautiful, is ancient. Somewhere in the distant past, someone looked at flour and water and decided that it deserved herbs, oil, or sweetness, because survival alone was not the whole point of eating. Flatbreads may be among humanity's oldest and most universal foods. They make immediate sense. A simple dough pressed thin cooks quickly, needs little equipment, and can be eaten with the hands, torn, folded, dipped, or wrapped around other foods. That practicality may help explain why flatbreads appear across so many times and places. They fit mobile life, village life, and urban life equally well. A hot stone, metal plate, clay wall, or dry pan can all do the job. The result may be crisp, pliable, blistered, soft, or chewy, depending on grain and method, but the underlying idea remains wonderfully direct. Turn ground starch and water into a thin sheet, add heat, and a meal becomes easier to share. What makes flatbread fascinating is not only its age, but its persistence. It never became obsolete. It still suits modern kitchens as perfectly as ancient hearths. Few foods are so old and yet so current. Its simplicity is not primitive in the dismissive sense. It is elegant, efficient, and nearly impossible to improve upon. Pita puffs because trapped steam inflates it like a balloon. That dramatic swelling in the oven looks almost like a trick, but it depends on a very precise chain of events. When the flattened dough hits intense heat, the outer surfaces begin setting quickly, while moisture inside turns to steam. Because the layers are still flexible enough at first, the steam forces them apart and creates a hollow pocket. For a brief moment, the whole round behaves like an edible balloon lifted by its own vapor. Then the structure sets and the pocket remains. That hollow is what later makes pita so useful for stuffing, tearing, and filling. The bread is designed by physics as much as by recipe. If the dough is too dry, too thick, or not heated sharply enough, the effect may fail. But when everything aligns, it is one of the most satisfying transformations in baking. A plain disc becomes a puffed form full of possibility. Bread here is not only nourishment. It is architecture created in seconds by heat and steam. None bakes against the wall of a fiercely hot oven. Few breads make their origins so visible in the final result. Traditional naan is slapped against the inner wall of a tandoor, where fierce heat radiates through the clay and cooks the dough in moments. Gravity is part of the drama. The baker must make the dough cling just long enough to blister, brown, and cook through before it is pulled free. That method gives naan its characteristic pattern of charred spots, soft interior, and quick-caught bubbles. The oven itself shapes the bread. A tandoor is not merely a heat source. It is the environment that creates naan's distinct balance of tenderness and fire-kissed surface. Watching it happen explains why the bread tastes the way it does. The dough enters one of the hottest worlds in traditional cooking and comes out transformed almost instantly. There is something thrilling in that speed. A wall of clay, a burst of heat, a practiced hand, and suddenly a blank piece of dough returns as something smoky, blistered, and ready to tear apart. Injera rises with fermentation and cooks into a spongy, edible plate. Injera does not behave like a loaf or a wrap. It arrives as a broad, fermented bread whose surface is filled with tiny holes and whose texture is springy enough to hold sauces while still tearing easily by hand. Made traditionally from teff, it develops through fermentation into something tangy, soft, and strikingly effective at the table. The bubbles that form during cooking leave its famous open pattern, turning the surface into a landscape built to catch flavor. This is why it works as both bread and serving base. Food sits on top of it, juices sink in, and every torn piece becomes both utensil and meal. The experience is wonderfully complete. You do not simply eat beside it. You eat with it, and eventually eat it too. That design feels ingenious. A grain, a ferment, and a hot surface combine to create a bread that carries dinner, absorbs it, and joins it. Few breads so perfectly merge structure, flavor, and communal eating. Tortillas transformed entire cuisines by making grain portable and flexible. The genius of the tortilla lies in how effortlessly it turns staple crops into movement. Once grain can be ground, mixed, flattened, and cooked into thin rounds, it becomes a food you can stack, carry, fold, wrap, and fill. Meals no longer need plates or heavy vessels in the same way. They become mobile. In Mesoamerica, the tortilla made maize not just edible, but endlessly adaptable, ready to accompany daily life in fields, homes, and markets. It could cradle beans, chili, vegetables, meats, or eggs. It could be torn for scooping, rolled for carrying, crisped for new forms, or softened again with sauce. That flexibility helped shape entire culinary worlds. The tortilla is therefore more than bread. It is a platform for cuisine itself. It gave structure to eating habits, portability to meals, and new forms to flavor. Once it existed, whole food traditions could grow around it. A simple round became one of the great engines of culinary invention. Bagels are boiled before baking, which changes their crust completely. Most breads go straight into the oven, but bagels take a detour through water first. That brief boil alters the outer starches and proteins before baking even begins, which changes how the crust forms later. The surface sets early, becoming smoother and tighter, and the final result is the chew and shine people recognize instantly. Without that step, a bagel would drift closer to an ordinary roll. With it, the bread becomes its own category. The boiling stage also helps preserve the ring's shape and encourages a crust that resists lightly before yielding. There is something wonderfully unexpected about this method. A bread associated with bakeries and breakfast first passes through a miniature bath. The process feels almost ceremonial, as if the dough must cross water before earning the oven. That unusual path is why bagels stand apart. Their identity is created not only by ingredients and shape, but by a moment of submersion that transforms the whole eating experience. Pretzels get their deep color from an alkaline bath before baking. That distinctive glossy brown is not produced by ordinary baking alone. Before entering the oven, pretzels are traditionally dipped in an alkaline solution, which raises the surface pH and dramatically changes how browning happens in the heat. The result is faster, deeper color, and a flavor that feels richer and more characteristic than an untreated dough could provide. The crust develops a slight bitterness and roasted edge that sets pretzels apart from simpler bread twists. This is one of those marvelous cases where a small chemical adjustment reshapes the final identity of the food. The pretzel's look and taste are not accidents of form. They are engineered by a quick bath that prepares the dough for a different encounter with the oven. What is especially striking is how ancient and practical the method feels despite sounding almost laboratory precise. Bread here moves right up against chemistry in a visible way. A brief dip changes the crust so completely that the whole bread becomes unmistakable. Croissants are bred by ancestry, but built through layers of butter. Under all that delicacy lies a dough with bread in its family line. Yet the method carries it somewhere else entirely. The magic comes from lamination. Butter is folded between repeated layers of dough until the structure becomes a stack of alternating sheets. In the oven, water in the butter turns to steam and pushes those layers apart, creating the fragile honeycomb interior and shattering crust people love. It is bread transformed into engineering. Instead of relying only on fermentation for lift, the croissant uses architecture. Every fold matters. Temperature matters. Even the firmness of the butter matters, because the whole design can fail if the layers merge or tear. The result feels luxurious, but the process is disciplined and exacting. When done well, the croissant seems impossibly light for something built from flour and fat. It shows how far bread can travel from its humble origins, while still keeping one foot in that old world of dough, yeast, and heat. Brioche uses so many eggs and butter, it almost becomes pastry. There comes a point where bread begins leaning toward dessert, and brioche lives right on that border. Its dough is enriched with generous amounts of butter and eggs, which transform both flavor and texture. The crumb becomes tender, rich, and almost silky, while the finished loaf carries a golden color and a fragrance closer to cake than to a rustic hearth bread. Yet it still belongs to the bread family, because yeast and dough structure remain at its core. That tension is what makes it fascinating. Brioche feels like a loaf dressed in festive clothes. It can hold jam, cradle savory fillings, become French toast, or stand alone as something nearly celebratory. Historically, such richness also signaled access to costly ingredients, which gave it an air of occasion. Bread did not need to stay austere. It could become indulgent. Brioche shows that once people had enough grain, butter, and eggs to spare, the loaf could begin crossing into luxury without fully surrendering its identity. Focaccia can hold pools of oil without losing its lightness. At first glance, it seems impossible that a bread so generously coated with olive oil could still feel airy rather than heavy. Yet focaccia manages exactly that. The dough is usually well hydrated, which helps create an open interior, while the oil enriches the surface and the dimples without collapsing the whole structure. Those dimples matter. They hold oil, salt, and toppings in place, turning the top into a landscape of concentrated flavor. In the oven, the oil helps the surface fry and bake at once, producing a crust that is crisp around the edges yet deeply aromatic. Inside, the crumb can remain soft and full of pockets. This balance is what makes focaccia so memorable. It feels abundant, but not dense. Rustic, but carefully designed. It shows that bread can welcome richness on the surface while keeping grace at the center. A sheet of dough becomes a feast of texture, where chew, crispness, oil, and air all arrive together. Soda bread rises without yeast, using chemistry that works almost instantly. Most breads ask for patience, but soda bread moves at a different speed. Instead of depending on living microbes to produce gas over hours, it uses a chemical reaction that begins as soon as baking soda meets acidity and moisture. Buttermilk is the classic partner. The moment the two come together, bubbles start forming, and that means the dough must be mixed lightly and baked quickly before its lifting power slips away. There is something thrilling about that urgency. This is bread made on a shorter fuse. Historically, that mattered in homes where time, fuel, or fresh yeast might be limited. With only a few ingredients, people could create a warm loaf in a fraction of the usual time. The texture is different from long fermented bread, of course, more tender and close-grained, but the effect is still impressive. A little chemistry, handled well, can create a satisfying rise without a single yeast cell doing the work. Cornbread follows different structural rules, Because corn lacks wheat's gluten. Corn brings warmth, sweetness, and colour to bread, but it does not behave like wheat. It lacks the elastic protein network that gives many loaves lift and stretch, which means cornbread follows a different logic from the start. Instead of building a chewy structure designed to trap expanding gas in a strong web, it relies more on batters, moisture balance, and quick rising methods. The result is not a failure of bread making. It is a different kind of success. Cornbread can be crumbly, tender, cakey, gritty, crisp-edged, or almost custardy, depending on region and recipe. It belongs to a world where the goal is not always lofty slices, but warmth, comfort, and a close connection to the grain itself. That is why cornbread has such a distinct place in food culture. It reminds us that the bread family is much broader than high-risen wheat loaves. Change the grain, and you change the whole idea of what bread can be. Rice breads prove bread does not truly belong to wheat alone. Wheat has dominated so much of bread history that it can seem inseparable from the idea itself. Yet, rice-based breads reveal a wider truth. In places where rice has long been central, people found ways to grind, ferment, steam, bake, or fry it into forms that serve many of the same roles bread serves elsewhere. These breads may be softer, stickier, springier, or more delicate than wheat loaves, but they still answer the same human desire to turn a staple grain into something shareable and shaped by hand. Some are made from batters rather than classic doughs. Some rely on steaming instead of dry oven heat. Some become wrappers, cakes, or flat rounds rather than sliced loaves. That variety is exactly what makes them so fascinating. Bread is not a single European story repeated around the world. It is a broader human habit of transformation. Rice breads show that once people understand their grain deeply enough, they can teach it to become something astonishing. Gluten-free loaves need new architectures because the usual net is missing. Take away the elastic scaffold that wheat provides, and bread must be reimagined from the ground up. In gluten-free baking, the challenge is not simply replacing one flour with another. It is building an entirely different system to hold gas, moisture, and shape. Bakers turn to mixtures of starches, whole grain flours, gums, psyllium, eggs, or other binders to create structure where the usual protein web cannot form. The dough may look more like a batter. The rise may depend on different balances of hydration and support. The final texture may be delicate rather than chewy, or surprisingly springy when the formula succeeds. That reinvention is what makes the field so interesting. It is not imitation in the simplest sense. It is design under new rules. Bread does not disappear when gluten does. It evolves. Each successful loaf proves that the idea of bread is more flexible than it once seemed, and that creativity can rebuild structure from very different materials. Some breads stay soft because fats slow the staling process. A rich loaf often seems to remain tender longer than a lean one, and that is not an illusion. Fats influence how bread ages by interfering with the internal changes that make crumb grow firm and less inviting. They also coat parts of the flour structure, soften the mouthfeel, and reduce the sense of dryness as days pass. This is why milk breads, buttery rolls, and enriched sandwich loaves often keep their plush texture better than simpler breads made only from flour, water, salt, and yeast. The difference can feel dramatic. One loaf turns stale quickly and begs to be toasted. Another stays gentle enough for soft sandwiches well beyond the first day. That staying power helped shape entire styles of bread, especially for households and commercial baking where freshness needed to last. Bread therefore stores not just through packaging or luck, but through recipe design. A little fat can act almost like a time buffer, holding tenderness in place longer than a lean dough can manage. Enriched doughs rise differently because sugar pulls water away from yeast. Sugar does more than sweeten a dough. In larger amounts, it also changes the working conditions for fermentation by competing for water. Yeast needs access to that water to function comfortably, and when a dough is rich in sugar, the microbes can find themselves under stress. Their pace slows. The rise becomes more deliberate, sometimes noticeably so. That is why sweet doughs often need patience, careful mixing, and sometimes special handling compared with simpler breads. The same ingredient that promises tenderness and sweetness can quietly make life harder for the organisms meant to lift the dough. Bakers therefore have to balance pleasure against performance. Too little attention, and a beautiful rich dough may remain dense or uneven. Enough understanding, and it becomes one of the most rewarding categories in baking. Brioche, buns, festive loaves, and sweet rolls all depend on this delicate negotiation. Bread here becomes a story of pressure and resilience, where yeast must work harder in a world made richer and more difficult. Seeds on a crust are more than decoration, they change flavor release. A seeded crust does not simply look appealing. It behaves differently in the mouth. Sesame, poppy, sunflower, flax, and other seeds toast during baking, releasing oils and aromatic compounds that add bursts of nuttiness, sweetness, bitterness, or roast, depending on the type. Because they sit on the exterior, they also reach the tongue and nose early in each bite, changing the first impression before the crumb even has its say. Texture shifts too. A smooth crust becomes speckled, crackly, and more varied, which keeps each bite lively. Some seeds even continue influencing the loaf after baking by a contributing scent as the bread warms again or is sliced. This makes them part of the bread's structure of experience, not just a garnish. A plain loaf and a seeded loaf may share the same dough, yet feel entirely different once they meet the senses. Bread can therefore be transformed from the outside in, with a scattered layer of seeds reshaping flavor, sound, and memory. Scoring dough guides expansion like planned fault lines in the crust. A loaf entering the oven is full of stored pressure. Heat drives gas expansion, steam forms inside, and the dough makes one last dramatic push upward before the structure fully sets. Scoring gives that force a place to go. Each cut weakens the surface in a controlled way, allowing the loaf to open where the baker chooses rather than tearing unpredictably. The comparison to fault lines is apt. Pressure builds beneath the crust, and the cut becomes the route along which the surface can split with purpose. This is why scoring matters so much for both beauty and function. A well-placed slash can help create better shape, better volume, and a more elegant ear or bloom on the finished loaf. It turns expansion into design. There is something wonderfully expressive about that moment. One sharp blade, one confident cut, and the baker begins directing how heat will rewrite the dough. The loaf then opens in the oven like a planned event, rather than an accident. An uncut loaf can burst open wherever pressure finds escape. Leave the surface unscored, and the oven will still demand an answer. As heat surges through the dough, gases and steam push outward, searching for the weakest point in the skin that has formed around the loaf. If no deliberate opening has been made, the pressure may force a split at the side, the base, or some odd seam the baker did not intend. The result can be dramatic and sometimes beautiful, but it is often unruly. Bread in that moment feels almost geological, as though hidden stress has finally found a crack in the earth. This is one reason bakers respect the surface of dough so much. A loaf is never passive in the oven. It is under tension, ready to break if not guided. When it bursts open on its own, you see the force that was always there. Even the humble loaf contains a kind of pressure event waiting to happen. The oven simply reveals whether that energy was directed or left to choose its own escape. Bakers read dough with their hands like musicians read rhythm. There is knowledge in touch that cannot be fully replaced by timers or formulas. An experienced baker feels resistance, slackness, stickiness, warmth, and elasticity, almost the way a musician feels tempo and phrasing. The dough sends signals through the fingertips. Is it tight and underdeveloped? Is it relaxed enough to shape? Is it fermenting with strength or losing its balance? These are not mystical questions. They are physical ones, answered by texture and movement. Yet the skill still looks close to art because it depends on repetition, memory, and sensitive adjustment. One dough may ask for another fold. Another may need rest. A recipe can suggest the path, but the hands often make the final judgment. That is why bread making remains so compelling even in a world of measurements and machines. The baker is not only following instructions. The baker is listening through touch. Dough has a rhythm to it, and good hands learn when to push, when to wait, and when the moment has arrived. Dough can be underproofed, overproofed, or perfectly poised for the oven. Proofing is the stage where patience becomes a gamble. Too little time, and the dough may still be tight, dense, and not ready to expand gracefully. Too much, and it can weaken, spread, or lose the energy needed for a strong oven rise. Somewhere between those two lies the ideal point, when the dough has filled with gas, relaxed into shape, and still holds enough strength for the oven's final push. Hitting that moment is one of baking's quiet triumphs. It is not always obvious. Dough does not ring a bell when it is ready. Bakers look for subtler signs, a certain feel, a slight wobble, the way an indentation springs back. This uncertainty is part of the drama. Bread asks not only for ingredients and heat, but for judgment under conditions that keep changing. Proof too soon or too long, and the loaf tells on you. Catch it at the right instant, and it seems to rise with extraordinary confidence. The windowpane test reveals whether gluten has developed enough strength. There is a wonderfully simple way to check whether a dough has built the structure it needs. Take a small piece and stretch it carefully between the fingers. If it can be drawn thin enough to let light pass through without tearing immediately, the network is well developed. If it rips too quickly, the dough may need more work or more rest. The image is memorable because the test feels almost magical. A lump of dough becomes a translucent film, like a tiny pane of edible glass. Yet the meaning is deeply practical. It shows whether the internal structure has reached the point where it can trap gas and support a good rise. Bakers love this test because it translates invisible protein development into something the eye can judge in seconds. Bread often hides its science, but here it reveals it openly. You stretch the dough, light comes through, and suddenly you know whether the loaf's hidden skeleton is ready for what comes next. Long fermentation can create deeper flavor without adding anything new. One of bread's most beautiful secrets is that intensity does not always require more ingredients. Sometimes it only requires more time. During a long fermentation, enzymes keep unlocking sugars, microbes keep producing acids and aromatic compounds, and the dough keeps changing in ways that layer flavor gradually. The result can be a loaf with notes that seem nuttier, tangier, sweeter, or more rounded, even though nothing extra was stirred into the bowl. This is why some of the most compelling breads begin with such short ingredient lists. The complexity comes from process rather than decoration. A baker is not piling on flavors from the outside. The baker is allowing the grain and fermentation to reveal more of themselves. That restraint is part of the wonder. Bread can become dramatically more interesting through waiting alone. It is a lesson in hidden abundance. Given enough time, flour and water can speak with far more depth than their simplicity first suggests. Cold proofing slows dough down and changes both taste and texture. Move dough into the cold, and the whole pace of development changes. Fermentation does not stop, but it slows enough to stretch time and alter the balance of what happens inside. Flavors can become more developed and better defined. The surface may dry slightly, making the loaf easier to score. Texture can shift as the dough firms, which also helps with shaping and handling. This is why refrigeration became such a powerful tool for bakers. It gave them more control over timing, but it also changed the bread itself. A slow, cold rise often produces loaves with a different character from those fermented entirely at room temperature. The difference may show up in aroma, crust, openness, and even in the calm confidence of the dough when it meets the oven. Cold proofing, therefore, feels like a conversation with time through temperature. Rather than hurrying fermentation along, the baker cools the whole system and lets the loaf deepen on a slower, steadier path. A starter fed for weeks can suddenly change personality overnight. A starter may seem dependable for days or even months, then suddenly behave as if it has become a different creature. It may smell sharper, rise faster, weaken unexpectedly, or drift into a new balance after a change in flour, temperature, feeding schedule, or simple chance. This volatility is part of what makes sourdough so fascinating. A culture is alive, and living systems do not remain perfectly fixed. Tiny shifts in conditions can favor one group of microbes over another, changing aroma, acidity, and performance with surprising speed. To a baker, this feels almost like mood. Yesterday, the starter was mild and steady. Today, it is urgent, sour, and unruly. Of course, the explanation lies in biology, not temperament. Yet the effect still feels personal when you are the one tending it. Bread here becomes a relationship with something responsive and unstable. The jar on the counter is not a machine. It is a community, and communities can change faster than they appear to from the outside. Bread making is chemistry, but it also rewards intuition and memory. Every loaf follows physical laws. Proteins bond, microbes ferment, starches swell, and heat transforms structure in ways chemistry can describe with real precision. Yet anyone who bakes regularly learns that description is not the whole story. Intuition grows alongside knowledge. The baker remembers how a dough felt on a humid day, how a starter behaved after travel, how a certain flour absorbed water more greedily than expected. These memories become practical wisdom. They shape decisions before numbers alone can explain them. This is why bread making attracts both scientists and craftspeople so strongly. It offers the satisfaction of measurable processes, but it still leaves room for judgment, habit, and a kind of bodily knowing. A baker may understand exactly why fermentation matters, and still rely on instinct to decide whether the dough needs 15 minutes more. Bread lives at that meeting point. It rewards understanding, but it also honors experience stored in the hands, the nose, and the quiet memory of many earlier loaves. Even humidity in the room can alter a loaf's final character. Bread does not exist in isolation from its surroundings. The room itself is part of the recipe, whether the baker acknowledges it or not. On humid days, flour may already hold more moisture from the air, changing how it absorbs water in the bowl. Dough surfaces may stay tackier for longer. Fermentation can feel different. Proofing cloths, wooden boards, and even stored ingredients respond to the atmosphere around them. In a dry environment, the surface may skin over more quickly. Shaping, scoring, and crust formation can all shift. This sensitivity is one reason identical recipes do not always produce identical bread. the environment keeps leaning in. Bakers learn to adapt by feel, adding a little flour here, protecting a resting loaf there, or adjusting expectations for timing and texture. Bread, therefore, remains wonderfully local, even indoors. The weather outside can reach all the way into the crumb. A loaf on a rainy day and a loaf on a dry day may carry different traces of the air that surrounded them. Altitude can sabotage familiar recipes by changing boiling and baking conditions. Take a trusted bread formula into the mountains, and it may begin misbehaving in surprising ways. Higher altitude means lower air pressure, and that changes how both water and dough respond. Water boils at a lower temperature, which alters moisture loss and the way heat moves through baking. Fermentation may seem to speed up because gases expand more readily. Dough can overrise, dry out, or bake unevenly if handled exactly as it would be at sea level. The same loaf that feels predictable at one elevation can become temperamental at another. This is one of those reminders that baking is never purely abstract. Bread happens in the real physical world, under the influence of gravity, pressure, and climate. Even the height of the land matters. Mountain bakers therefore become translators between recipe and environment, adjusting hydration, timing, and expectations to fit thinner air. Bread is humble enough to sit on a kitchen table, yet sensitive enough to notice how far above the sea that kitchen happens to be. Wood-fired ovens bake differently, because heat comes from every direction. A wood-fired oven creates an environment unlike most modern home ovens. Once the masonry is thoroughly heated, it radiates stored energy from the floor, walls, and curved ceiling, surrounding the bread in an even and powerful heat field. Flames and embers also contribute moving air and direct intensity, while the hot floor drives strong bottom heat into the loaf. This combination can produce exceptional crust, rapid expansion, and a distinctive balance between char, color, and interior tenderness. The oven itself becomes part of the bread's flavor and texture, not just the place where baking happens. There is also an element of theater. Fire must be built, managed, and judged. The baker reads the oven as much as the dough, watching the masonry, the coals, and the timing of the retained heat. Bread from such an oven often feels alive with the memory of flame. It carries something elemental, as though the loaf has passed through a more ancient and more dramatic kind of heat. Ancient Egyptians may have been the first great masters of leavened bread. In ancient Egypt, bread seems to have moved from simple survival food into something far more refined and deliberate. Bakers there were working at scale, using cereal agriculture, grinding technology, and organized labor to produce loaves in large numbers. More importantly, they appear to have understood how to work with risen dough, whether through saved fermenting mixtures, brewery byproducts, or repeated observation of dough that swelled and softened over time. Egyptian tomb paintings and excavated ovens suggest a society where baking had already become skilled craft rather than rough improvisation. Loaves were made in many forms, from everyday staples to shaped breads with status or ritual meaning. That matters because mastery of leavening changed the eating experience completely. Food became lighter, more varied, and easier to digest in new ways. In Egypt, bread was tied to work, wages, religion, and state power. It was not only baked well, it was woven deeply into civilization, almost as if the whole society rose with it. Roman bakeries were industrial enough to feed entire urban populations. By the time Rome reached its height, bread production had become a vast urban operation. This was not a handful of family ovens serving a village. It was an organized system built to feed dense populations in one of the largest cities on Earth. Grain arrived through imperial networks. Mills, powered by animals or water, turned it into flour. Large bakeries mixed, shaped, and baked on a scale that feels surprisingly modern. In places like Pompeii, archaeologists have found mills, ovens, counters, and whole production spaces that show how structured the work had become. Bread was already part of city logistics. A metropolis could not function without a steady supply of it. That changed the baker's role. The baker was no longer only a craftsperson. The baker was also part of the machinery of urban life. Rome's appetite helped push bread toward mass production, proving that one humble food could sit at the center of an empire's daily survival. Some soldiers were paid partly in grain that became daily bread. For many fighting men in the ancient and medieval worlds, grain was not a side benefit. It was part of the real substance of pay. Wages might be irregular, coin could be scarce, and supply chains were fragile. But grain could still sustain an army if it reached camp. That meant a soldier's compensation often arrived in a form that still needed work. The harvest had to be ground, cooked, or baked before it became dinner. In practical terms, military power was tied not only to weapons and discipline, but to whether men could reliably turn rations into bread. Marches, sieges, and campaigns all depended on that ordinary transformation. Hungry troops do not remain loyal for long. Bread therefore sat close to morale, endurance, and combat readiness. There is something striking in that image. Behind banners, armor, and conquest stood sacks of grain waiting to become loaves. Empires could dream grandly, but their soldiers still marched on bread. Medieval towns often regulated bread prices more strictly than many luxuries. A jewel or silk garment might be admired, but bread was watched. In many medieval towns, authorities treated it as too essential to leave fully to chance. Prices, quality, and production could be regulated with a seriousness that reflected bread's central place in survival. When a food feeds nearly everyone every day, any sharp rise in price becomes dangerous. It can stir anger quickly, especially among the poor, whose lives were already balanced on narrow margins. Town governments understood this. Bread therefore became an object of civic control, shaped by ordinances, inspections, and penalties meant to prevent fraud or protect supply. That does not mean every rule was fair, but it does show what mattered most. Luxuries could fluctuate. Bread could not, at least not without consequences. Its regulation reveals a larger truth about pre-modern life. The most ordinary foods were often the most politically sensitive. A loaf was never just a loaf when an entire town's stability could depend on its price. The weight of a loaf was once a matter of law. In some times and places, selling bread meant submitting to rules about exactly how much a loaf should weigh for a given price. This was not fussiness for its own sake. It was a form of public trust. If grain prices changed, if harvests failed, or if bakers tried to protect themselves by shrinking loaves secretly, ordinary people could suffer at once. Laws therefore stepped in to define acceptable sizes and punish cheating. The buyer had a right to know what a coin or daily wage would secure at the bakehouse. This is one reason bread occupied such a strange place between market and moral obligation. A loaf was sold, yes, but it was also bound up with fairness, reputation, and communal stability. Bakers who gave short weight could be fined or shamed because the offense reached beyond commerce. It touched survival. Few modern foods carry that legacy so visibly. Bread once came with legal expectations measured not in taste, but in ounces, honesty, and public peace. Famine, revolt, and revolution have often begun with the price of bread. When bread becomes too expensive, the problem is never only culinary. It strikes at the minimum conditions of life. Across history, rising bread prices have helped turn private hardship into public fury because they reveal that something deeper has gone wrong. Harvest failure, bad policy, corruption, war, transport collapse, or hoarding can all show themselves first at the bakery. Once a staple becomes unreachable, people do not need political theory to understand the danger. They feel it in the body. That is why bread has appeared so often in the background of unrest, from local riots to world-changing upheavals. Crowds may rally around many grievances, but hunger gives those grievances heat. Bread becomes the point where economics, power, and survival meet in the most immediate way possible. A price written on a loaf can suddenly become a verdict on a whole regime. History keeps returning to this lesson. When staples fail, societies can move from strain to anger with astonishing speed. Breadlines became powerful symbols during some of history's hardest years. A breadline is more than a queue for food. It is a visible map of hardship. In times of depression, war, collapse, or severe unemployment, lines for bread turned suffering into a public scene that no one could easily ignore. Men, women, and children waiting for a loaf carried a message more powerful than statistics. They showed that hunger had entered everyday life and that the basic promise of society had frayed. The loaf at the end of the line was small, but what it represented was enormous. It meant temporary relief, dignity strained to its limit, and a thin barrier between order and desperation. Photographs and memories of such lines endure because they condense an era into one stark image. Bread again becomes the measuring rod of whether a society is coping or failing. When people line up simply to secure the day's most basic food, the line itself becomes historical testimony. It says, without explanation, that the times have turned hard. Religious rituals around the world have given bread sacred meaning. Bread's place on the table made it an easy candidate for the altar. Because it sustains life so directly, many traditions began to treat it as more than ordinary food. It could stand for blessing, gratitude, divine presence, hospitality, sacrifice, memory, or the bond between people and the sacred. In some traditions, it is blessed and shared in ritual meals. In others, it appears in offerings, holy days, seasonal observances, or symbolic reenactments of foundational stories. That spiritual role makes sense. A loaf already carries labor, time, harvest, and transformation. It begins in the field, passes through human hands, and emerges changed by heat. Few foods are better suited to symbolize dependence, abundance, and renewal all at once. Once bread entered ritual life, it gained a second existence beyond nutrition. It could feed the soul as well as the body, at least in the imagination of worshippers. Its sacred career reveals how easily daily necessity can rise into meaning. Breaking bread together became a symbol of trust long before modern times. To share bread is to make a small promise. It says that those at the table will eat from the same source, in the same moment, under the same conditions. Long before the modern language of networking or diplomacy, meals built alliances in this simpler way. Bread was especially powerful in that setting because it was easy to divide, easy to pass, and widely recognized as essential. Tearing a loaf and sharing it turned a staple into a social bond. The act suggested welcome rather than threat, kinship rather than distance. It could mark friendship, settlement of tension, hospitality to a stranger, or entry into a household's protection. Even now, phrases about breaking bread still carry that older warmth. They point to trust formed through eating together. Bread thus gained symbolic weight not because it was rare, but because it was common enough to matter to everyone. A shared loaf could say, with quiet force, that for this meal at least, no one was alone. Bakers once worked through the night so cities could wake fed. The daily rhythm of urban bread once depended on people whose working day began when everyone else was heading to bed. Dough needed time to ferment, ovens needed time to heat, and loaves had to be ready by morning when households, workers, and markets came to life. That meant bakers often lived on a reversed schedule, laboring in heat, darkness, and fatigue so the bread could appear fresh at dawn. It was demanding work. Flour dust filled the air. Fire had to be managed. Timing had to be exact. A mistake in the night could echo across the whole next day's supply. There is something almost invisible about this labor in modern memory. We see the loaf in the morning light and forget the sleepless effort behind it. Yet whole cities once relied on these nocturnal routines. Bread arrived at breakfast because someone had already been working for hours while the streets were still dark. The baker's night became the city's ordinary morning. Community ovens turned bread into a shared social rhythm, not just food. In many places, not every household had the means to maintain its own serious baking oven. Fuel was costly, ovens were bulky, and firing them properly required planning. So communities built or relied on shared ovens, and that changed the whole meaning of baking. Dough might be mixed at home, but the final stage became collective. People arrived with shaped loaves, waited their turn, talked, watched, exchanged news, and returned later for the finished bread. The oven became a neighborhood pulse point, a place where domestic life briefly entered public view. Baking was therefore woven into shared time. Certain days or hours might belong to oven use, and families organized themselves around that schedule. Bread still fed individual households, but its production also reinforced community presence. A shared oven made private hunger visible as a common human condition. The loaf was no longer only a household object. It had passed through a public ritual, warmed by communal fire and accompanied by communal life. Some villages still bake festival bread shaped like animals, suns, or knots. In certain places, bread still appears not only as food but as symbolic form. Festival loaves may be twisted, braided, molded, or sculpted into shapes that carry seasonal, religious, or local meaning. Animals can suggest fertility, blessing, or pastoral life. Sun forms can echo harvest cycles or the return of light. Knots may stand for continuity, union, or protection. These breads are fascinating because they blur the line between bakery and folk art. The dough becomes a material for memory. It records what a community celebrates, fears, or hopes for, then carries those meanings into the shared meal. Often the shapes are passed down through habit rather than formal instruction, which makes them even more precious. A village can preserve stories in flour as surely as in song. When these breads appear, they remind us that bread need not stay plain to remain essential. It can become ceremonial, decorative, and expressive without losing its deep connection to nourishment and community. Funeral breads, wedding breads, and harvest breads mark life's turning points. Bread appears so often at major life moments because it is both ordinary enough to feel intimate and meaningful enough to carry ceremony. At weddings, special loaves may symbolize union, abundance, or the shared household to come. At harvest festivals, bread can embody gratitude for the season's success and the hope of survival through winter. At funerals, it may stand for memory, continuity, or the fellowship of those left behind. In each case, bread helps turn transition into ritual. It gives the event something tangible to bless, break, offer, or share. That is a powerful role for such a familiar food. A loaf can move from daily necessity into the realm of life's biggest moments without feeling out of place. It belongs there because it already belongs everywhere. Bread has fed people on ordinary mornings for millennia. It is only fitting that it should also stand beside them at marriage, mourning, and the turning of the agricultural year. Bread stamps and decorative molds turned ordinary loaves into cultural art. Some breads were never meant to be anonymous. Bakers and households in different traditions pressed dough with carved stamps, shaped it in molds, or decorated it with patterns that carried identity, blessing, ownership, or celebration. A plain loaf became marked with symbols, geometric designs, floral motifs, saints, festivals, or family customs. These marks could help distinguish ritual breads from daily ones, or transform a gift loaf into something visibly special before it was even tasted. The beauty of this tradition lies in its union of usefulness and artistry. The dough still had to rise, bake, and nourish, yet it also became a surface for visual expression. Bread could therefore hold culture twice over, first in recipe and then in design. A stamped loaf says that daily food deserves ornament. It also says that beauty need not be separate from utility. Even a humble staple could emerge from the oven carrying not just crust and crumb, but a recognizable imprint of the world that made it. In many languages, the word for bread also means food itself. That overlap tells you almost everything about bread's historical place in human life. When the same word can mean both a loaf and nourishment more broadly, bread has clearly moved beyond one item among many. It has become the default image of sustenance. Language does not make that leap casually. It does so when a food is so central that it comes to stand for eating, livelihood, or daily survival in general. This can be heard in expressions linking bread with work, existence, or the means to live. The loaf becomes shorthand for life's necessities. That linguistic role is one of bread's most powerful legacies because it shows how deeply it entered thought itself. Bread was not just consumed. It organized metaphor, prayer, economics, and memory. Once a staple reaches that level, it becomes hard to separate from culture's most basic ideas about provision. The dictionary meaning may seem simple, but behind it lies centuries in which bread was close enough to hunger to become language for survival. Breadcrumbs helped cooks waste almost nothing from yesterday's loaves. Once bread dried beyond easy slicing, it did not have to be discarded. It could be grated, crushed, or pounded into crumbs and returned to the kitchen as a new kind of ingredient. That small act of transformation mattered in households where waste was dangerous and thrift was a daily virtue. Breadcrumbs could thicken sauces, stretch meat mixtures, top baked dishes, bind fillings, coat foods for frying, or add texture where none existed before. In other words, stale bread did not become useless. It became flexible. This is one of the quiet geniuses of older food cultures. They treated bread as too valuable to throw away merely because time had changed its texture. A loaf could live a second life in dozens of forms. Breadcrumbs therefore represent more than economy. They represent a way of seeing food as always recoverable through skill. What seems exhausted to one cook becomes possibility to another. Even the remains of bread could continue feeding imagination, not just appetite. Stale bread has inspired soups, desserts, sauces, and entire national dishes. When bread grew old, cooks did not always mourn it. Many of them built cuisines around its afterlife. Hard bread could soften in broth and become the body of soup. It could be layered with liquid and sweetness to become dessert. It could be turned into thickening for sauces, into dumplings, into savory bakes, or into rustic dishes that later came to define whole regions. This is a wonderful reversal. What begins as decline becomes creativity. Yesterday's loaf, too firm for easy eating, becomes the foundation of something richer than before. In many food traditions, some of the most beloved dishes owe their existence to the refusal to waste bread. That means staleness was not always an ending. It was often an invitation. Bread changed texture, and cooks answered with invention. entire national and regional identities now include dishes born from that practical wisdom. A stale loaf could still feed a household, but more than that, it could inspire recipes strong enough to outlast the original loaf itself. Croutons began as a clever answer to bread that had hardened. A hardened loaf might seem like a disappointment until someone realized that dryness could become an advantage. Cut stale bread into cubes or pieces, toast or fry it, and suddenly the problem becomes texture. Croutons bring crunch, roasted flavor, and a kind of edible punctuation to soups and salads. They are small, but they change the whole eating experience by adding contrast where softness or liquid might otherwise dominate. This is why they have lasted so long. They do not merely rescue old bread, they improve other foods. That is a remarkable shift. The stale loaf is not only saved from waste, it is promoted into a new role. Bread becomes seasoning by texture. A bowl of soup can feel more complete, more interesting, more satisfying, because an earlier loaf hardened at just the right time. Croutons remind us that culinary invention often begins with refusal. Refusal to waste, refusal to discard, refusal to believe that a changed loaf has nothing left to offer. Bread pudding turned leftovers into something rich enough for celebration. There is real magic in the transformation from stale fragments to something luxurious. Bread pudding begins with pieces too dry or broken to feel impressive on their own, then restores them through milk or cream, eggs, sugar, and heat into a soft, rich whole. The old bread absorbs liquid, swells, and becomes custardy, while the top may brown into something fragrant and golden. What was once nearing the end of usefulness returns as dessert. That reversal helps explain the dish's lasting appeal. It carries thrift and comfort together. On one level, it is practical household cooking. On another, it can become deeply indulgent, especially when flavored with spices, dried fruit, caramel, or sauce. Few dishes demonstrate so clearly that economy and pleasure do not need to be opposites. Bread pudding takes one of the plainest leftovers in the kitchen and guides it toward celebration. It is the culinary equivalent of redemption, where yesterday's scraps return to the table as something people genuinely look forward to. Sandwiches changed eating habits by turning bread into a portable container. Once bread became the wrapper as well as part of the meal, eating patterns shifted. Food no longer had to be served only from bowls, plates, or shared dishes. It could be enclosed, carried, stacked, and eaten with one hand. That made meals faster, more mobile, and easier to fit into work, travel, and urban life. The sandwich is brilliant because it reassigns bread's job. Instead of sitting beside the filling, it becomes the structure holding the filling together. This changes not only convenience, but cuisine itself. Ingredients that might once require utensils can now travel in pockets, baskets, lunch tins, and hands. It is easy to underestimate how important that is. A simple arrangement of bread around food helped create new habits for laborers, school children, travelers, and modern city dwellers. The sandwich turned bread into architecture on the move. Once that happened, the loaf stopped being only accompaniment and became one of the most practical inventions in everyday eating. Sliced bread reshaped modern kitchens, factories, and daily routines almost overnight. When machine-sliced loaves arrived, bread stopped being just a baked object and became a new kind of convenience. Suddenly, every piece was ready at once, evenly cut, easy to toast, easy to stack, easy to turn into sandwiches at speed. That changed domestic life more than it may first appear. Breakfast became faster. Lunch packing became simpler. Children, workers, and busy households could prepare food with less effort and less skill. But the change did not stop in the kitchen. Bakeries had to rethink production, wrapping, transport, and freshness. because sliced loaves stale differently and break more easily than whole ones. Factories adapted. Packaging improved. Machines had to cut quickly without crushing soft bread into useless fragments. The modern routine of grabbing uniform slices from a bag now feels natural, yet it was once a startling innovation. Bread had been reinvented again, not by a new grain or a new oven, but by a new way of dividing the loaf before it ever reached the table. Pre-sliced loaves were once sold with machines built to protect freshness. Slicing was only half the problem. Once a loaf had been cut into neat pieces, all those exposed surfaces could begin drying much faster than the crust of an intact loaf ever would. So the success of sliced bread depended not just on blades, but on packaging. Early sliced loaves needed to be wrapped quickly and effectively to hold softness in. This pushed bread further into the modern age of machines, waxed papers, sealed bags, and production lines timed around exposure to air. The loaf was no longer finished when it left the oven. It now had to pass through a second system designed to preserve its new convenience. That is part of what makes sliced bread such a fascinating invention. It seems simple, yet it required an entire supporting world of engineering to make it practical. Freshness became a mechanical problem. Bread, once sold bare or loosely wrapped, now traveled through a carefully managed process, just to remain soft enough for the effortless sandwich future it promised. Industrial bread used speed and precision to make softness widely affordable. For most of history, consistently soft bread took time, skill, and often money. Industrial baking changed that by treating bread production as a system that could be measured, standardized, and accelerated. Mixing became faster. Proofing became more controlled. Ovens became more uniform. Ingredients could be handled at scale with remarkable consistency. The result was a kind of softness once associated with refinement becoming available to far more people at a low cost. That mattered enormously. For millions, the everyday loaf became lighter, cheaper, and more predictable than older local breads had often been. Of course, something was lost too, sometimes flavor, individuality, or craft variation. But the achievement itself was still extraordinary. Soft bread stopped being a luxury experience and became a mass expectation. That is one reason industrial bread shaped modern life so powerfully. It democratized a certain style of loaf. The factory took qualities once limited by labor and turned them into routine features of ordinary daily bread. Commercial yeast made bread more predictable, but sometimes less flavorful. Once bakers could rely on cultivated commercial yeast rather than whatever wild fermentation happened to develop, bread became easier to control. Rising times grew more dependable. Dough behaved more consistently. Production could be planned with less uncertainty. For commercial bakeries and busy households, that reliability was revolutionary. It took some of the risk and mystery out of leavening and turned bread into a more manageable process. Yet the trade was real. Wild and mixed fermentations often produce broader flavor through acids, varied aromas, and slower development. Pure commercial yeast tends to be efficient and clean, but sometimes less complex in the final taste if speed becomes the main goal. This is why some loaves feel straightforward and soft, while others taste layered, tangy, or deeply aromatic. The yeast itself helps shape that difference. Bread's modern story therefore includes both liberation and simplification. Predictability made baking easier for many people, but in some cases it also narrowed the flavor world that older fermentation traditions had built. The Chorleywood process transformed bread making with speed, energy, and engineering. In the 20th century, bread in Britain changed dramatically through a method that treated dough less like a slow craft and more like an engineered system. The Chorleywood bread process used intense mechanical mixing, controlled additives, and carefully managed inputs to develop dough far faster than traditional long fermentation would allow. This meant bread could be made quickly from lower protein wheat that might not otherwise have performed so well in conventional methods. For industry, the advantages were enormous. Production sped up. Costs dropped. Soft loaves could be turned out in massive quantities with remarkable regularity. For consumers, it helped make cheap sandwich bread a fixture of modern life. Yet the method also became controversial, because many people felt something had been lost in texture, keeping quality, or flavor depth. That tension is what makes it so interesting. It was not merely a recipe adjustment. It was a redefinition of what a loaf could be when engineering, economics, and national food supply all pressed in together. Fresh bread sounds alive because crackling crust releases heat and steam. Set a newly baked loaf on the counter and listen closely. You may hear tiny snaps, ticks, and crackles rising from the crust as it cools. Bakers sometimes call this singing, and the name fits beautifully because the sound feels like the bread is still speaking after it leaves the oven. The cause lies in the crust itself. As the loaf cools, steam escapes, moisture redistributes, and the outer shell contracts and shifts under changing tension. Those minute fractures create the delicate sounds that make fresh bread seem almost animate. It is one of the loveliest moments in baking because it reminds you the loaf is not static yet. It is still settling into itself, still releasing the final traces of fire. Few foods announce their freshness so audibly. A loaf can sit quietly on a rack and yet sound alive in the room. Bread does not merely cool. It performs a soft aftersong, as if heat were leaving in little whispers. Smell scientists can identify bread aromas produced only during baking. The aroma of baking bread is not just pleasant. It is chemically distinctive enough that scientists can study it as a changing cloud of specific compounds released under heat. Some molecules emerge during fermentation. Others appear only once baking begins, when crust reactions, evaporating alcohols, and heated grain compounds create a scent profile that raw dough could never produce. This means the smell drifting from an oven is not simply stronger bread smell. It is a new event, built in real time by heat. Researchers can isolate compounds linked with toasted, nutty, caramel, roasted, or malty notes and trace how they appear during different stages of baking. That is astonishing when you think about it. The scent that makes people pause in a doorway or follow their nose into a bakery is a precisely evolving signal, rich enough to be analyzed in detail. Yet it still feels magical at human scale. Bread's aroma is chemistry turned into irresistible invitation, and some of its finest notes exist only in that brief, hot moment. Color on a crust hints at flavor long before the first bite. The eye begins tasting bread before the mouth does. A pale crust suggests one kind of experience, perhaps soft, mild, and lightly baked. A deep amber or chestnut crust suggests something fuller, more roasted, more bittersweet, more assertive. That is because color on bread is not decorative. It is evidence of what heat has done. Browning often tracks with the development of aroma and flavor on the surface, so the shade of the crust becomes a rough map of what kind of bite is waiting. Bakers know this intuitively. They do not judge loaves by color alone, but they read it as a sign of how far the bread has traveled in the oven. The eater does something similar without thinking. A dark loaf promises intensity. A golden one promises delicacy. Bread is therefore communicating before it is cut. Crust color becomes a visual forecast, letting the senses prepare for toast, sweetness, roast, and depth before the knife ever breaks the surface. Chewing bread begins digestion immediately because enzymes in saliva attack starch. The story of bread does not stop when it enters the mouth. Digestion begins almost at once, and bread is one of the clearest examples of that early transformation. Saliva contains enzymes that start breaking starch into simpler sugars while the food is still being chewed. This is why bread can seem to change in flavor as you keep it in the mouth. What began as bland or mildly savory may become faintly sweeter with time, because your own body is already dismantling the grain's stored energy. It is a remarkable moment if you pause to notice it. Eating becomes chemistry in real time. The loaf that was shaped by enzymes, microbes, and heat now meets a new set of enzymes supplied by the person eating it. Bread enters the body through a process that begins with touch, aroma, and sound, then moves straight into molecular change. Even before swallowing, the conversation between loaf and human has already become intimate and active. Bread can feel comforting because memory and smell are tightly linked. Few food aromas travel so quickly into memory. The scent of bread warming, toasting, or emerging from an oven can stir recollections of kitchens, childhood breakfasts, family tables, markets, holidays, or moments of safety that the mind has not visited in years. This happens because smell is closely tied to brain systems involved in emotion and memory, which means bread can feel comforting before a single bite is taken. The response is often immediate and difficult to explain fully. A person may say, "The smell feels like home," even if they cannot name why. That emotional force helps explain bread's lasting power in culture. It does not merely feed, it reassures. It suggests warmth, shelter, routine, and care. Of course, not every memory attached to bread is the same, but the pattern is widespread enough to matter. Bread's comfort is not imaginary. It is rooted in the way human brains connect scent, feeling, and the remembered geography of everyday life. Some loaves are designed to tear, while others are designed to slice. Not every bread is trying to become neat sandwich geometry. Some are built for the hand rather than the knife. Dinner rolls, pull-apart breads, braided loaves, and many festive breads invite tearing because sharing is part of their purpose. Their structure often favors softness, strands, or segments that separate satisfyingly under the fingers. Other breads aim for clean slices, steady crumb, and enough uniformity to hold fillings or make even toast. That difference shapes everything from mixing and proofing to final form. A terrible loaf can feel communal, abundant, and informal. A sliceable loaf feels orderly, portable, and practical in another way. Neither is superior. They are solving different social problems. One asks how people will gather around it. The other asks how it will perform in planned portions. Bread's design therefore reaches beyond texture into behavior at the table. The loaf is already predicting how humans will approach it, whether with hands reaching in together or with knife and board ready to divide. Sandwich bread and hearth bread are solving completely different problems. Put the two side by side, and the contrast becomes clear. Sandwich bread is often built for regularity, softness, and ease of slicing. It wants a predictable shape, fine crumb and crust, that will not fight too hard when folded around fillings. Hearth bread, by contrast, often embraces bold crust, irregular form, and a more open or dramatic interior. It may be baked directly on a hot surface, aiming for a stronger shell and deeper oven spring. These are not just stylistic choices. They reflect different purposes. One bread is serving convenience, portability, and everyday utility. The other is often serving table presence, crust experience, dipping, tearing, or the pleasures of a more expressive crumb. Bread here becomes product design in the oldest sense. The loaf is tailored to how it will be used. Understanding that makes the category more fascinating. There is no single ideal bread. there are breads optimized for different human needs, and their shapes, textures, and crusts reveal those intentions immediately. A loaf's open holes reveal how gas moved through living dough. Cut into a rustic loaf, and those irregular holes are not random decoration. They are the frozen record of fermentation, shaping, hydration, and handling all interacting inside a living dough. Each pocket marks a place where gas expanded and was successfully held as the loaf baked. Larger holes may suggest wetter dough, gentler handling, or vigorous fermentation. Smaller, more even holes may suggest tighter structure or a different style entirely. In that sense, the crumb is like an interior map of the loaf's life before the oven locked it in place. Bakers read it almost the way geologists read rock layers or historians read old letters. It tells them what happened inside the dough when nobody could see directly. That is one reason slicing bread can feel so revealing. The crust hides the story until the knife opens it. Then, the invisible past becomes visible. The loaf's inner chambers show where living breath once moved, pressed, stretched, and finally hardened into edible structure. Dense bread is not always a failure. Some traditions prize it. Modern baking culture often praises height, openness, and lightness so strongly that density can seem like a mistake. But that is only true in certain styles. Many breads are meant to be close-grained, moist, weighty, or richly compact. Rye loaves, festive enriched breads, steamed breads, seeded loaves, and many regional specialties carry their value in concentration rather than airiness. A dense bread can slice thinly, keep well, support strong flavors, and deliver a more sustained chew and presence than a lofty loaf ever could. In some traditions, heaviness suggests nourishment, seriousness, or grain character preserved rather than refined away. The idea that all bread should be light is therefore historically narrow. Bread has many ideals, and some of them live in forms that feel almost solemn in the hand. This is part of what makes the topic so rich. Texture becomes cultural language. One person's failure is another tradition's masterpiece, because the bread is answering a different vision of what satisfaction means. The best bread knives are built to saw without crushing structure. A good loaf can be damaged in an instant by the wrong blade. Bread's interior is often soft, airy, or delicate, while the crust may be crisp, brittle, or deeply resistant. That combination demands a knife that can cut by repeated light sawing rather than brute downward force. Serrations do the work by catching and moving through the crust a little at a time, sparing the crumb from being squashed flat before the slice is complete. This may sound like a small detail, yet it changes the whole experience of serving bread. A poor cut can tear tunnels through the interior, compress the crumb, and leave ragged edges that diminish both appearance and texture. A proper bread knife respects the loaf's architecture. It passes through with enough aggression for the crust and enough delicacy for everything beneath. That is a lovely final reminder that bread remains a structured object. Even after baking, it asks to be handled with understanding, right down to the choice of blade. Even crumbs can reveal whether a loaf was mixed, fermented, and baked well. The crumb of bread is not just what fills the space between crusts. It is evidence. Bakers look at color, elasticity, moisture, hole pattern, and tenderness to understand what happened long before slicing. A gummy interior may point toward underbaking or insufficient setting. A crumb that tears in one way and springs in another may hint at mixing choices or fermentation balance. Even the scent released from the cup surface can reveal whether the loaf developed fully or remained dull. That is why evaluating bread after baking can feel almost forensic. The loaf carries clues everywhere inside it. Nothing stays completely hidden. What looked beautiful on the outside may confess its faults once opened, while a modest crust may hide a wonderfully structured interior. Bread rewards this kind of reading because it preserves process so honestly. The crumb is a report written in texture. If you know how to pay attention, a single slice can tell you a surprising amount about the entire life of the dough. Bread survives across deserts, mountains, and oceans because grain travels well. One reason bread spreads so widely is the grain itself is remarkably portable. Once dried and stored properly, cereal grains can travel long distances without spoiling quickly, which makes them ideal companions for trade, migration, conquest, and settlement. Flour can be milled later. Dough can be adapted to whatever fuel, water, and tools are available on arrival. This flexibility gave bread extraordinary reach. It could move with caravans, ships, armies, and settlers into landscapes that looked nothing alike. In each place, the grain met local habits and became something new. That portability helped bread survive across deserts where storage mattered, mountains where fuel and time were precious, and seafaring worlds where preserved staples were essential. Bread is therefore not only a story of ovens and fields. It is also a story of movement. Grain travels first, then bread follows. Few foods are so well built for both rooted agriculture and long human journeys at the same time. Humanity keeps reinventing bread because it adapts to almost any world. That may be bread's greatest secret. It is not locked to one grain, one oven, one climate, one social class, or one way of eating. It can be flat, risen, steamed, fried, torn, sliced, fermented, sweetened, enriched, dried, revived, or repurposed. It can belong to emperors, farmers, monks, travelers, factory workers, and home cooks all at once. Whenever humans settle into a landscape and begin learning what it offers, some form of bread often appears sooner or later because the concept is so adaptable. Grind a staple, add liquid, shape it, heat it, and the possibilities multiply from there. This is why bread never stays finished. Every age, region, and technology finds new reasons to reshape it. Even now, with all of bread's long history behind us, people keep inventing methods, forms, and meanings. Bread survives not because it is fixed, but because it is endlessly open to reinvention. It bends with humanity, and therefore follows humanity almost everywhere. Few foods have carried more science, memory, labor, and meaning than bread. A loaf can seem almost modest until you begin unfolding everything inside it. There is plant breeding and soil, weather and harvest, milling and storage. There is microbiology and fermentation, chemistry and crust formation, physics in steam expansion, and sensory science in aroma and texture. Yet alongside all that science sits memory, class, religion, law, hunger, celebration, and daily routine. Bread fed workers, marked rituals, sparked unrest, inspired inventions, and anchored family life for centuries. It belongs equally to the field, the bakery, the laboratory, and the dinner table. That range is astonishing. Most foods are important in one or two of these ways. Bread seems to occupy almost all of them at once. It is technical and emotional, ordinary and symbolic, practical and beautiful. That is why it rewards such close attention. The deeper you look, the more impossible it becomes to dismiss as simple. Bread may be humble in appearance, but its human story is immense. A simple loaf is really a record of earth, microbes, heat, and time. Pick up a loaf, and you are holding far more than baked flour. You are holding the field that grew the grain, the weather that shaped the harvest, the soil that fed the roots, and the labor that brought seed to mill. You are also holding microbial life, whether commercial yeast or a wilder ferment, because rise and flavor both depend on organisms invisible to the eye. Then comes heat, which fixes structure, colors crust, and unlocks aroma. And through it all runs time. Time in the season, time in fermentation, time in proofing, time in baking, time in cooling. Bread gathers all of these forces into something the hand can lift. That is what makes it feel so endlessly fascinating. A loaf is not just food. It is a compressed history of natural processes and human choices, meeting in one final form. By the time it reaches the table, birth, microbes, heat, and time have all left their signatures on it. As we come to the end of tonight's journey, we leave behind a world that may have seemed simple at first, but turned out to be vast, ancient, and full of wonder. We followed bread from the first hot stones and early fires, through fields of grain, rising dough, and glowing ovens. We wandered through villages, empires, marketplaces, and family kitchens. We traced the hidden work of yeast, the patience of fermentation, the crackle of crust, and the long human story folded into every loaf. It is strange, and rather beautiful, to think that something so ordinary can hold so much. A piece of bread can carry the memory of harvests, the movement of hands, the warmth of the hearth, and the passage of centuries. It can be torn, shared, blessed, traded, toasted, and remembered. And somehow, through all of that, it remains humble. Just flour, water, salt, time, and life, becoming something more than the sum of its parts. Now the ovens are cooling. The tables are quiet. The last crumbs rest where they fell, and the day can begin to loosen its hold on you. If you enjoyed this slow journey through the science and story of bread, I'd love for you to stay a while longer by liking, subscribing, or sharing a thought below. And if you happen to still be awake, there'll be another video waiting for you on screen in just a moment. But for now, let your body grow heavier. Let your breathing slow. And let your thoughts drift softly, like warm air rising from a fresh loaf into the evening. Sleep well, and good night.